And we've got our recording going. Okay, welcome everybody. We'll just give everyone a moment here for Zoom to let everybody in. We're at the top of the hour now. And just another moment here as we see everybody coming in. And I see we're live on YouTube. Welcome to those of you that are watching there. Okay, welcome to the Friday webinar, everybody. I'm Executive Director with Conservatory Canada, Derek Auger. It's our pleasure to present these webinars every Friday, or nearly every Friday afternoon at noon Eastern Time. And this is our final one for 2023. We're going to take a few weeks off now for the holiday. I know a lot of us get quite busy over the holiday time doing recitals and things like that with our students, taking some time away. Hopefully, I hope all of you get your time away here over the New Year's break as well. And so we're going to resume later on in January 12th. George is going to come back with Stella Sick, and they're going to talk about the waltz, which is going to be a really fun one. And then on Friday, January 19th, we'll have Eleanor Gummer and Cecile DeRosier coming back to talk to us about music by women composers. And then I'm still yet to book someone for January 26th. Then into February, we're going to have presentations by Alessandro DiCenzo, whom we met with here 2 weeks ago, and as well as Eleanor and Cecile coming back after that. And then a whole slew of new ones that I'm booking into February, March, and April that you will enjoy, I'm sure. And so to the matter at hand today, this is a really interesting topic, I think. And I've had some experience looking at the new additions here that Dr. Arthur Houle has put together, and George in the SuperScore app with regard to these Clementi Sonatinas that we all know and love and we use with our students. Some of the additions and things they're talking about, I'm really looking forward to listening to them discuss. Just so everyone's aware, we've made this announcement sort of quietly in different places, but Conservatory Canada is working on replacing its New Millennium Series piano repertoire books, which have been in print since 1999. That's 24 years we're going on now. They're in desperate need of an update, I think, and so we're working so that by next academic year, sometime in the summer, we'll be releasing a new series with a pre-grade 1 book as well as grades 1 to 8. It will include Baroque, classical, romantic, and modern music in it, very much like our current album, but updated with all new music. And I'll tell you, as we look through some of these Clementi Sonatinas, I think you're going to see some of these movements in there in this form that you're going to discuss today. So very exciting. If anyone has any questions about that, let me know or throw them in the chat box. More details to come about that. And if anyone has any questions during the presentation here today, as usual, throw them in the chat box or the Q&A. And Arthur and George will step out later on at the end and answer these questions, which I'm sure you will have. So George and Arthur, thanks for joining us today. Arthur, I know it's your first time here. Welcome. And I'll turn it over to you both now.
Thank you very much, Derek. And again, my name is George Litterst. For those of you who regularly attend these webinars sponsored by Conservatory Canada, I'm probably not a stranger to you. I'd like to introduce my good friend and colleague, Dr. Arthur Houle. He's now a retired professor of piano from University of Colorado, Colorado Mesa University. Got to get the names there in the right order. I actually have a little bit of history with Arthur that's kind of interesting. We kind of crossed paths back in the 1970s at New England Conservatory, where we were both doing study in Boston, and I certainly knew who he was at the time with his trademark mustache and everything. I'm not sure if he had noticed me back in those days, but over the years we've encountered each other many times at MTNAs and College Music Society conferences, and it came about that we've collaborated here on these Clementi Sonatinas. So welcome, Arthur. Glad to have you here with me today.
Good to be here. Yeah.
Good. So we'll have more to say later on about actual publications that we have done together. But in the meanwhile, we just want to launch into things because we got quite a fun set of quiz questions and historical material to share with you today. So we're talking about the unknown Clementi Sonatinas. And as we've already stated, we are George Litterst and I'm speaking to you from the Midwest today, which is not my native area for these presentations. I'm out of town. And Arthur, where are you from today?
And I'm speaking to you from Boise, Idaho, from my home.
Very good. So these progressive sonatinas for the pianoforte were published for the first time in 1797. They were remarkable for their inventiveness, the way in which they reflected the dramatic development of the pianoforte that was taking place at the time, and for the fact that they provided marvelous material for millions of aspiring pianists for the last 225 years.
Since the time of their original publication, as you can see, there have been innumerable republications of this Opus 36, some highly edited and others purporting to be Urtext editions. Remarkably, there are, however, amazing discrepancies among the various editions, including among those published by Clementi himself. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into these issues in search of Clementi's final musical intentions.
So to start things off, we're going to present you with a little quiz just to see how well you know your Clementi.
So imagine that you are judging a competition and two students play the first movement of the first sonatina. Which one do you think is playing this passage correctly?
Here is student A. And now student B. Now, if those examples went by you a little quickly, I will play the highlighted areas more slowly. For student A. And student B. So I would like you to note down your answers, because after we give you several more questions, we will come back and reveal what is correct. So in this next example, we're going to be asking you which version was performed in the correct octave. Again, let's imagine that you were faced with two students playing this movement in a competition.
In this case, each student plays the opening in a different octave register. Which one is correct?
And student B. On to question number 3. Pedaling in classical music can be controversial. We'd like to get your opinion on this one.
So let's say you purchase an edition that shows this extended sustain pedal during a scale passage. Would you play the passage this way? Is it correct?
Now let's move on to a matter of tempo. Tempos provide plenty of fodder for musical debate. Which of these tempo markings seems like it is correct for this movement?
Now keep in mind that the time signature in both of these cases is alla breva.
Now the second example. Let's move on to yet another question. We're all familiar with the tradition of concert pianists altering scores to suit themselves.
So see if you can guess which concert pianist extended this section of the development of the first movement of the fifth sonatina. Here, at first, is the original version, to be followed by the altered version.
Now we have the altered version. Quite a lot of difference there. So now we're going to move on to another dramatic change that was applied to a development movement, this time in the sixth sonatina, first movement.
So here is Clementi's original version, followed by the altered version. Note the high range, pedal, and the music box-like effect in the altered version.
This is the look of the altered edition. And a final quiz question. We'd like you to determine which of two tempo markings that we're going to present actually represents authentic Clementi.
Keep in mind that in Clementi's own chart of tempos, published in his Introduction to the Art of Playing on the Pianoforte, Opus 42, the word spiritoso by itself is declared to be faster than both allegro and vivace.
Example A. And now example B.
Now it is time to grade yourself.
And we can all take comfort in the fact that we're grading our answers privately, perhaps. In the first quiz question, both versions were actually written by Clementi, albeit at different moments in time, between 15 and 18 years apart. And therefore, both students played correctly. As we'll demonstrate in this presentation, Clementi made substantial revisions to these sonatinas circa 1815. And today, few editions include these alterations. And I think I'd like to let you hear those differences again I'm going to play the one on the right first, student B. That is the familiar one. And then student A.
That was the familiar one, actually.
Yeah, in case there was confusion, I was deliberately playing student B first and the familiar, and then student A. And the boxed areas are showing differences. And while we're not getting into the issue of fingering at this moment, and I had deliberately erased the fingerings from these two to disguise them, you might be interested to know that the fingering that Clementi actually gives in the original suggests a certain type of articulation there in measure 7. I'll play that again. Measure 7, he fingers 4-2, 4-2, 4-2, 4-2. And if you actually play with that fingering, you're likely to come up with an interpretation somewhat like that.
So in this one, the question is similar to the previous one. Both students are playing the movement as written by Clementi himself, albeit at different moments in time.
And I think we've got the time to do this, Arthur, so I'm going to repeat the playbacks of these so we can compare. So the one on the left, the original. And the revised. So the issue of pedal markings through scale passage seems perhaps a little bizarre, but by golly, these pedal markings come from Clementi himself. In the early 19th century, the pianoforte was not nearly as resonant as it is today, and at the time, pedals were becoming an expected feature. It shouldn't be surprising, therefore, to think that a forward-looking composer like Clementi, in fact, a composer who was manufacturing pianofortes, would introduce pedaling, even extended pedaling, like these markings that we see here, in his revised scores. And let's take another listen to the sound of that.
Clementi's original tempo for this movement was un poco adagio. In his revised 5th edition, circa 1815, he changed the tempo to andante, which is definitely faster. However, and this is quite amazing, in his final 6th edition, he changed the tempo once again, but now to adagio, which is slower than the other two tempos, even the original tempo. So any of these tempos can work, so long as we are mindful, however, that the time signature is in cut time.
So let's listen to these again. In our next quiz question, we asked, which famous pianist revised this passage? Adding 3 additional measures, pedaling, and additional dynamics. Perhaps a rather audacious thing to do. But by golly, it again was Clementi himself. And I'd like again to play both examples. Here was the original. And the audacious revision.
This is also the case with the altered harmonies, octave shifts, extended pedaling, and the new and dramatic contrasts of texture found in the revised version of this movement.
Let's remind ourselves what it sounded like. That was the original, and the one you're seeing on the screen, which is the revised, sounds like this. So I would like to divert a little bit from our planned conversation on these at this point and remark that my colleague Arthur, who recorded this particular example, took a little bit of time there on the fermata. I feel as though he was probably holding back some other urges. Do you want to speak to that issue, Arthur?
Oh, yeah. Well, back in those days, Clementi and his contemporaries would have absolutely done some sort of a lead-in cadenza there. Well, my edition, which we'll address at the very end, has in the footnotes some examples of what you might do, some suggestions. Other thing I wanted to mention, I referred to this as a music box effect when the recapitulation comes in, because it's rather remarkable, that long pedal and the octave above. When I first heard this, it just struck me that it sounded like a music box. And I looked up when the music box was invented, because I wanted to make darn sure that it preceded this revised version, and it did, because that would have certainly blown it out of the water if I had found out it was invented too late. So that's pure speculation on my part, but I think it's pretty plausible. What do you think, George? It sounds awful lot like a music box to me.
Oh, I think very much so. And of course, in the what is the second movement of the fourth sonatina, we have the original Swiss air. Again, it's a little bit reminiscent of that genre of music, for sure. And automata in general, very popular in the late 18th century. And of course, we know Beethoven's good friend Mazel invented the metronome and again, saw those mechanics that were being put to good use. So this, I think, was our last quiz question, and everybody should have gotten an excellent answer on this one, because either tempo can be stated as the correct tempo. And we have to credit this tempo.
Could I hasten to add?
Sure.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, George.
No, go ahead.
A little pet peeve of mine, and I think, well, a lot of editions today read allegro spiritoso. Let me state categorically that there's absolutely no primary source, legitimate primary source, where Clementi used the word allegro. He said allegretto spiritoso and allegretto pastoral, but the word allegro is absolutely wrong. There was one edition that came out years ago I think that just goofed and put Allegro, and as a result, everybody kind of followed suit. So please, if you see that in your score, it is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. It's absolutely not authentic.
So here's a little reminder of what the middle-aged Clementi felt about tempo. And then the elder Clementi, maybe spending a little more time in the British countryside, I don't know, came up with this.
By the way, I did a considerable amount of research on the word pastoral. It definitely suggests almost a lullaby. So that's really a considerable change of tempo when you consider allegretto pastoral versus, say, those erroneous tempos of allegro spiritoso. That's a very, very big difference.
Absolutely.
So to understand these and many other differences among editions published by Clementi himself, it is important to put the publication of Opus 36 in an historical context, which George will explain.
So Clementi was born in 1752, and as a young teenager, he was sent to live with a well-to-do family in England. Apparently, this family was visiting in Italy and encountered this young boy who was just really facile at the keyboard, and they made an arrangement with his father that they'd take the boy back to England and I guess take good care of him. But his job was essentially to, as a self-taught keyboardist, to become a good player and to entertain in the household there. So at this time, you would have expected such a household to have a harpsichord or a clavichord for a keyboard instrument. But things began to change in England in the 1760s, the decade in which Johann Christian Bach gave the first public performances on a pianoforte in England. In the decades that followed, Clementi pursued a career as a performer, a composer, and teacher, and ultimately becoming one of the most important exponents of the new keyboard instrument.
In 1797, Clementi became involved with the business of his music publisher, Longman and Broderip. The company published sheet music and also manufactured pianos. The company was in a troubled financial state. In 1798, Clementi became a partner in the company. By 1801, however, he was the head of the company, holding that position until his death in 1832.
So as the pianoforte developed in England, it quickly grew larger than the 4-octave size of Bartolomeo Cristofori's original keyboard invention. And the 5-octave instrument was standard for a period of time.
So all 17 movements of Clementi's Opus 36 Sonatinas are playable on the 5-octave instrument. I should hasten to add that would be the original version, I should say, of the Opus 36 are playable on the 5-octave instrument. But as the 18th century gave way to the 19th century, the 5.5 octave instruments emerged as the new standard size.
And notice the sustain pedal there in this instrument.
And as we shall see shortly, Clementi's revision of the 6 progressive sonatinas around 1815 was designed to take advantage of the additional notes of the 5.5 octave pianoforte. In fact, 14 of the 17 revised movements require the additional notes.
So let's take a look at the publication history of Opus 36. Clementi published these sonatinas for the first time in 1797. In that year, there were apparently 2 editions, one without fingering which you see on the screen, and one with fingering. The cover, as you can clearly read there, makes quite a point about the fingering being provided by the composer himself. That was a real novelty.
We don't know for sure which of these two editions came first, but we presume that it was the unfingered edition. In 1801, these sonatinas were published again with fingerings, this with the new publisher name of Muzio Clementi and Company. This edition contains a mixture of errors of omission and a small number of enhancements to the earlier versions. Within the next few years, Clementi and Company printed the work again, this time reprinting the original unfingered edition with a new cover added.
In 1806, another edition was released that includes fingerings. Although the cover is new, the music appears to be printed from the same plates as the first edition from Muzio Clementi and Company.
Within a few years, Clementi published a fourth edition. This edition is quite unique and intriguing. It's a new engraving of the work, still with fingerings by the composer. In the tradition of the earlier publications, it sadly has some errors of omission, but it also contains some noteworthy enhancements and occasional remarkable foreshadowings of his subsequent revised editions. In addition, it contains the statement, NB, or nota bene, out of the various modes of fingering the same passage. The author, Clementi, has preferred that which appeared to him best calculated to form the hand of the beginner.
And I'll just add parenthetically that when we talk about errors of omission, we're not talking about leaving out measures of music. It'd be leaving out a staccato and slur, that type of thing. So big changes were introduced with the so-called fifth edition. And I'll just remark, if you look carefully at the cover, you can see it very clearly states fifth edition on the cover, whereas the earlier editions did not state a version number. And we believe that this came out circa 1813 to 1815. Again, just parenthesis on this. Dating these things can be quite a challenge, and in the case of this one, the actual artifact itself, the paper on which the music was printed, has a watermark from the producer of the paper, and the watermark was from 1813, so we would know that this was not prior to 1813, but likely the paper was sitting around for a while, so it could have been as late as 1815 that this was actually printed. That's how these dates are often figured. And the cover, again, states that the edition includes actually, not additionally, this is a new statement, that the cover contained a statement that says that there are considerable improvements by the author. I've often imagined how fun it would be to meet Mr. Clementi on the street and say, now, what was the failure that you had with your previous edition? you felt like you needed to improve it. Anyway, throughout this edition, we can see a complete rethinking of the work by the composer, inspired in part by musical opportunities produced by pianos that have this extended 5.5 octave range. Now, when rewriting the passages using the new higher notes, Clementi doggedly eschews the octave symbol, preferring to use ledger lines instead. And in the music, he justifies this with a statement that says, quote, "The student cannot be familiarized too soon with ledger lines."
Let me quickly interject that I once asked Sandra Rosenblum, the rather renowned, musicologist, I said, do you consider all those changes in the 5th edition and 6th edition, do you really think they're improvements? And she wrote something a little bit coy, you might say, in response to the effect that, well, Clementi was a good businessman. Meaning, I think after, I mean, that's a long topic, but in my opinion, quite a few of them are, I think, improvements, but some of them, they're just changes. And well, you make more money if you sell more editions. So, he was a businessman.
Yeah, and it also provides a good reason to get that larger instrument.
There you go, to sell pianos. Thank you, George. So circa 1820, maybe 1821, Clementi produced yet a sixth edition, again with the statement that it includes considerable improvements by the author. However, numerous apparent errors of omission make this version somewhat less reliable than the fifth generally. Interestingly, Clementi gives up what you were talking about earlier, George, the excessive use of ledger lines. I think he changed his mind and introduces the octave above symbol. My guess is probably students and teachers perhaps complained or just said, this is too hard. I don't know, but it's almost amusing to see.
So this was a revelation to Arthur and me when we got together and pooled our sources of scholarship to discover that there was, in fact, a seventh edition, but it was published after Clementi passed away. Clementi passed away in 1832, and his company assets were dispersed. Thomas Purday, a music publisher, purchased the print portion of the business. In 1835, Purday advertised a seventh edition of these sonatinas. Generally speaking, this edition is nearly identical to the sixth. However, it corrects errors introduced in the sixth edition. And that was of great excitement to Arthur and me, I think, as we were talking about, as we were developing our editions, that we think that this is an error of omission in the sixth edition, and the fifth is a more authoritative, and so forth. And then we discovered that, wow, there was a seventh edition, and it confirmed everything that we thought in that regard.
Well, the irony, as you know, George, is that, excuse me, I got a frog in my throat. The irony is that technically, I suppose, to a musicologist, the seventh edition is not authentic in that it was not published by Clementi. But because it's correcting the errors in the previous, it's more reliable.
And it makes one think that perhaps this was work that was maybe in progress at the publishing company even before Clementi died. I mean, it's really hard to know. But there's another little wrinkle about this seventh edition.
George, why don't you take this over? I'm losing my voice.
Okay, happy to do so. So on the cover, Purday prints this admonishment, quote, "The public are cautioned against a spurious edition of the work, which is neither fingered by Mr. Clementi or has his late alterations and additions." So it's important to realize at this time that there were copyright laws in England and in Europe, but the way the things were developing, the enforcement of these things was a bit spotty. So there were other editions that were circulating, and Henley, who has published their own Urtext edition based on the original, not on the revised, kind of poo-pooed the revised as not really being particularly important. But they suggested that the edition published by Breitkopf and Hertel, which was based on the original, really should rule the day. But that edition published by Breitkopf and Hertel as part of a so-called complete works of Clementi predates, apparently, his fifth edition. So I'd rather suspect that the fact that Breitkopf and Hertel had published a complete edition of Clementi's works prior to Clementi's revision made it easier for people to ignore the revisions and go with, the authoritative one from Breitkopf.
I'd like to interject something very quickly that it was the tradition back in those days to actually do repeats. So my recommendation, because I still love the original version, I mean, the easiest thing to do is to play the original version the first time and then do the revised version on the repeat. And I would strongly recommend that to students and teachers myself.
And that will keep them practicing.
There you go. So what our research shows is that we can place the multiple editions of Opus 36 into two basic groups. Those based on the original edition, that would be 1 through 4, and those based on the revised edition, also known as the 5th and 6th editions.
The original edition, with various discrepancies, was produced many times in the course of a decade and a half, as you can see here on the screen.
The revised edition was produced twice in Clementi's lifetime, as we mentioned, the 5th and 6th editions, and was maintained, as we also mentioned, by his publishing successor, Thomas Purday. And by the way, I have to credit George. He's the one who discovered that 7th edition. My jaw hit the floor. I commend you for finding that. Despite this history and the admonitions of Mr. Purday, nearly all editions published today are based closely or loosely on the original publication of 1797, or sometimes the 1801.
And that 7th edition I found in the dusty online shelves of the British Library. So we have some other examples that we'd like to show you, as well as to entertain questions. But I'd like to tell you about locations where you can find Clementi's work based on the revised edition. I'll skip to this slide to start with. This is the SuperScore edition that I began work on several years ago. And when I was beginning work on this edition, I was doing research on the internet, and I encountered Arthur's name. And of course, I knew who Arthur Houle was. And there was an indication that Arthur was about to produce an edition with all of these, with a major reconciliation of all of these discrepancies about which I had only vague knowledge at that point. And so, Arthur, what was the year that you published this? Was it?
This was 2017.
That's what I thought. So
yeah.
I was the first person, I'm happy to say, at the 2017 MTNA conference to purchase this edition, because I had to see Arthur's research here and decide what to do. And Arthur, I'm sure you want to comment on it, but I'll just give you my own take, which is that it's a highly unusual edition in that Arthur's essentially created these overlays on each piece so that you can kind of see where this comes from the original, this comes from the 4th edition, this comes from the 5th, and so forth, and really see it all wrapped up together in one.
And very, very copious notes. Also, I mean, it's an unusual combination of very scholarly, but also very creative, because they were back then. And so in the footnotes, I have lots of suggestions for how you can stylistically appropriately do creative things with the music.
So that's a print edition that's available from Abundant Silence, and you've got the website there on the screen, abundantsilence.store. So with all of that tremendous scholarship that Arthur had gone through, dating back to, I think, am I correct, Arthur, the 1990s?
Oh gosh, yeah. I spent at least 2 or 3 years tracking down sources and over 20 years producing the edition.
So it was incumbent upon me to reach out and ask Arthur to participate in the SuperScore edition, which he gracefully did. And
I thought I invited myself because I got so excited that you were going to do this, but whatever.
Well, I wasn't going to tell the audience that. I was thrilled that you did. And so we've put this SuperScore edition together. And in this edition, there's a big preface that talks about the history and the sources and so forth. And then what we've done is we've created a single edition of the original. based on the first 4 editions, reconciling the errors and so forth, and the little enhancements that took place along the way. And then we've got separately all 17 movements again in a revised edition, which is a reconciliation of the 5th and 6th with some validation from the 7th. And so you've got both editions, and I've recorded the music for the original, and Arthur has for the revised. So you've got playback for all of them.
I also have creative recordings of the revised version on YouTube, so you can scope that out.
Yes, if you want to see how to add a little cadenza in here and there, that's some very good material there.
By the way, when I was done my edition, I told myself, there's nobody on earth that could possibly take this research further. And I have to say, you're the only person on earth, George, that I can even imagine taking the research so much further, that which was very, very exciting to me. So, I applaud you.
Well, it's always great to stand on somebody else's shoulders. So it's been a lot of fun.
That's why my shoulders are hurting. Okay.
So Derek, we have some additional examples of interest to show, but if there are any questions, this would be a good moment to take some.
Yeah, no questions that I'm seeing at this moment, fellas. Go ahead and continue on with your extra things. This is quite enjoyable and enlightening so far.
Okay. Well, what I'm going to do then is I'm going to share my iPad screen and pull up some examples that way. Take a moment to come up. This is the Sonatina number 4. And we're looking at the revised, but I think I want to show you first the original. So let me go and pull that up. The original number 4. Okay, so this is the way, just as a reminder, the piece starts. And it's in sonata form. There's an exposition and development, and there's going to be a recap with something very interesting that happens on the return of the theme. So I'm going to start playback at the end of the development. So that turn that you see there on the screen, we have placed that in the original edition as published in SuperScore. It was not found in the edition of 1797 or in several of the editions that followed, but it was there in the 4th edition. So this is one of the examples that to which Arthur had alluded a couple of times of little increments of musical enhancement that foreshadow the revised. Now, if we take a look at the same passage in the revised edition, we'll see something also that's very interesting. So I will start playback in the same place and let it run a little bit further. And Arthur, I think you might want to comment on what's coming up here.
Well, not only is that turn there, but he adds a long pedal mark, which is a little bit tricky, I think, on a modern piano. I would recommend probably a half pedal, maybe some una corda, and please don't play the left hand too loud. So if you do all of the above, I think you can simulate the really very nice effect that he intended. You do have to take into account the difference in the timbre of pianos of his day versus our day.
I think in your recording, you really handled that quite beautifully. And we see this in the development here. I'll back up.
Oh, I love this one.
The final part of the exposition here. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to repeat. Let's go ahead here. Let's start right there.
that was, sorry.
What were you about to say, Arthur? I think Arthur has gotten frozen on us. Hopefully I'm not frozen. Derek, you have me still?
Yeah, you're still with us, George. Arthur, will just be a second.
Sorry, I didn't catch that, George. My Wi-Fi is a little bit spotty.
Okay, so we were at the end of the development there, and you were about to make a comment, and we missed it.
That place where he pedals the repeated C's, the pedal point. It's fascinating that that's through disparate harmonies. Maybe you can pull that up again. Yeah, I mean, that's one of those things that absolutely shouldn't work. It defies gravity almost. But if you play it really, really well voiced, and again, maybe una corda and maybe a half pedal on a modern piano, it's an exquisite effect. And it dovetails with other rather provocative pedals by, say, Haydn late in his life. So it's not completely unique, but it's very, I suppose, jarring and stunning to modern pianists.
So I'd like to pull up another example from the fourth sonatina. We'll take a look this time at the second movement in the original. And where I want to go is, well, let me just show you, remind you the way the movement begins. Okay, so we're going to have a recap of that over in this spot, and I'm going to play the music that leads into that. Now let's see what Clementi did in his revised edition. Whoops, back to the, whoops. Let's take that again. Number 4, revised, here we go. Start in the same place. So if I had heard Arthur play this passage in a recital and I was unfamiliar with the fact that there was a revised edition, I would have said to myself, well, that's Arthur being Arthur. He's adding a cadenza here in the music. But what's the truth of the matter, Arthur?
Well, he put in 2 extra measures that are absolutely not needed, judging from the first version, but they're wonderful. So that is an example of a written out lead-in cadenza. It's a great template to do similar kinds of things, even if he hasn't written them out explicitly in other places that are comparable. It's very common in either an ABA form or a sonata form, which is really kind of like an ABA form anyway. So right before the return of A or before the return of a recapitulation, that's really perfect place according to classic era, well, even Baroque era performance practice to insert a little lead-in cadenza where essentially you're stretching out the dominant seventh. It's basically a throwback to a vocal practice.
So I'd like to bring up one final fun example. I'm going to go to the fifth sonatina, third movement. We'll pull it up in the revised edition. And let's just remind ourselves how the theme goes for this wonderful rondo. So we've made the point that these pieces have been highly influential in piano instruction over the last 225 years or so. And as we all know, lots of musicians start their childhood musical experience on the piano and then maybe later on move to other instruments. And it's remarkable to think of just how influential some of this music by Clementi has become. If you're as old as someone like Arthur or me, you might have enjoyed dancing to this at maybe a sock hop in the 1960s.
When I'm feeling blue, all I have to do is take a look at you. Then I'm not so blue. When you're close to me, I can feel your heartbeat. I can hear you breathing in my ear.
And thanks to the miracles of YouTube, we can relive those moments. That was a rendition by the Mindbenders in 1996, Groovy Kind of Love. And over the years, it's been covered by Diane Hall and Anita Ray in 65, Petula Clark, Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells, Sonny and Cher, Phil Collins, the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra with Lewis Clark, Neil Diamond, Gina Lodwick, David Garrett, the Wedding String Quartet, and guitarist Augustin Amigo. So Clementi's influence, very important in musical life. So I think that brings us to a conclusion here, Derek.
Okay, very interesting indeed. It was really neat to see all these examples side by side. Thanks for taking the time to prepare them for us and create that narrative through why we should take this edition seriously. I think it's well worth looking at. Now I'd like to turn to our audience here, our live audience. Does anyone have any questions or comments about the debate here today and looking at this thing? I know one thing that comes to mind, I think that the question that's going to come forward once these versions of the Sonatinas come out a little farther and wide, perhaps, is, you know, what examiners want to hear on an exam, let's say, because of Conservatory Canada, that's a lot of what we do. And our answer is typically you can use any version, any edition. Our examiners are not so concerned about the edition that we're using. Students can still play it in any of those manner of ways and do well with it. I think by the time we get, 200 years past where these are published, there are certain performance practice standards that evolve. But when it comes to this in particular, because you presented a really great argument here, and there are published versions that make sense, students can pick and choose whatever one they have at their disposal, as long as we honor the composer's intentions on some level, whether it's his first intentions or whether it's his later or her later intentions. I think those are all valid, and so that's what we want to advocate for. Students are not going to certainly lose marks for using one edition over another, is what I should say, I think, to everyone. Lillian's asking, just wondering, what's the name of the song just played, that final song, George?
Yes, and it's called A Groovy Kind of Love.
By the way, I just want to address real quick, Derek, what you said. There was a student, teacher relayed this to me. It was a little distressing, who used my edition, number 3, the C major, with that long pedal mark through the scale passage. And apparently the adjudicator was pretty brutal in the comment that, you absolutely cannot pedal there, even though the edition clearly stipulates in their footnotes, and it explains, they all explain. So, you run into that. I mean, I've also had people play Mozart very much the way Mozart would have played his own music, very crispy and, shorter slurs and all that. And again, if the adjudicator doesn't have the background and has a legato bias, then again, you run into problems. But, to me, that's an issue of getting the right adjudicators, to put it.
Well,
Yeah.
I would say that such a student, if the student was my student, that you can now wear a musical badge of courage.
That's a good way of putting it. Absolutely. And I was going to ask you about the pedaling too, and I think you illuminated it quite well, what some of those solutions are, maybe what some of the reasons were, why Clementi would suddenly blur an entire measure or two measures over different harmony changes, because that piano that he had access to would make that sound quite different. It would still be transparent, even though that extra sustain was there. And as you cautioned too, on a modern piano, we have to be careful. We have to find another solution typically to make it sound good. And through the SuperScore app, we can hear your performances. And I think you make a really good case for it, that we still have to be sensitive to it. But at the time they were, I mean, I hazard a guess that they were just looking for ways to explore this new pedal that they had at the time.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, when you get into the 1820s, there were pianos that had even up to 7 pedals on them with all kinds of things. There was a pedal that was known as a janissary, and it would basically strike a little bell and it'd give it a little ching kind of a sound. And there's one that would be a thumper that would thump the bottom of the soundboard, and
Sure.
a moderator that would,
I have a theory that the Turkish rondo Mozart, da-da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-dum, that must have been that Janissary band effect. I'll stake my life it was written for one of those special pianos with weird effects that you could get. I don't know that for a fact, but I'll bet.
well, because they're so far apart in time by a couple of decades, I would think, if anything, it would be the developer of the piano maybe being inspired by that piece. I don't know.
Okay, never mind. You know better. I got it backwards.
There was a moderator pedal that would put a piece of parchment on top of the strings and give a little buzzy sound to it.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And the pianos of that era, of course, had considerable timbral distinctions between the different registers, whereas with the modern piano, we look for a more even timbre throughout. And that no doubt affects how the overtones aggregate when the sustain pedals engaged and things like that.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Yeah, this is all really good detail for us to consider. And really, I think the bottom line is the common denominator is just keep an open mind and understand that, you know, we're always learning about history, but our ability to learn things about this time period from 200 years ago is somewhat imperfect. But I think you two have done a really great job today at bringing us as close as we can get to that perfection so that we understand our options and what the limitations are. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. Last call, if anyone wants to raise your hand and come on live and ask a question because you don't want to type into it, that's certainly welcome as well. And in the absence of seeing any other questions, and we're at the top of the hour now, I think we will sign off for today. And in fact, the year 2023, this is the last webinar for the year, as I mentioned earlier. And it's been a pleasure to host these, and we look forward to doing more in the coming month or so, or in January, rather, in mid-January, we'll start again. And as I mentioned and alluded to earlier, we're going to have a lot of more guests from the US, and George and Arthur are both from the US. We're going to have more along this line coming up in the new year. Okay, very interesting stuff, fellas. Thanks so much for your time today. Thanks to the audience for being here. Thanks to the YouTube audience for being here, and those of you watching this after the fact, and in some cases maybe well after the fact. And we look forward to seeing you all in the new year. Hope you have a restful holiday if you can, and get a break from your teaching if you can too. I'm sure you're all doing really good work. Thanks, and bye.
A lot of fun.
As we say in the Houle household, happy Houle days.
Happy Houle days. Okay, take care, everybody. Bye for now.
Bye-bye now.